Millionaire farmer gave his worst land as inheritance to his poorest son. But 6 months later, Richard Johnson adjusted the brown felt hat on his head and took a deep breath before calling his 3 sons into the farm's main room. At 68, the patriarch had decided it was time to divide his land, but the way he would do it would surprise everyone and forever change the family's fate. Then he announced his decision. To Michael and David, his 2 oldest sons who always visited bearing expensive gifts and empty praises, he left the most fertile and productive parts of the property. To Matthew, the youngest at 35, who worked as a teacher in Chicago and rarely visited the farm, he gave only the dry, rocky plot at the back of the property, where even grass struggled to grow. "Dad, are you sure about this division?" asked Michael, the eldest, trying to hide a satisfied smile. "Not that I'm questioning your wisdom, but—" "I'm absolutely certain," Richard replied, carefully watching his son's reactions. "Each of you is getting exactly what you deserve." David, the middle son, couldn't hold back a mocking laugh. "Poor Matthew. He'll have to plant rocks and hope something grows," he said, clapping his younger brother on the shoulder with false sympathy. Matthew stayed silent, staring at the document describing his inheritance. The plot was just 5 acres, abandoned for years, and everyone in the Midwest region knew it was barren. Still, he stood and hugged his father. "Thank you, Dad. I'll take good care of the land you've given me," he said, tears in his eyes. Matthew's wife, Sarah, was 6 months pregnant and had stayed home that day. When he returned and told her about the inheritance, she couldn't hide her worry. "Matthew, how are we going to support our family with that land? Everyone knows nothing grows there," she said, resting a hand on her rounded belly. "I don't know, Sarah, but I trust my father had his reasons. He never does anything without purpose," Matthew replied, holding her tenderly. The following week, Michael and David were already making grand plans for their land. Michael wanted to plant soybeans for export, while David planned to raise cattle. Both hired expensive managers and bought new tractors. Meanwhile, Matthew visited his inherited land for the first time. What he saw disheartened him. The soil was parched, full of rocks, and had a small, abandoned shack that looked more like a ruin. There was no electricity. Water came from an old well that barely worked, and the access road was full of potholes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Sarah cried when she saw the state of the place. The shack had a leaky roof, peeling walls and a dirt floor. There was no indoor bathroom, just an outhouse in the back that was falling apart. "Matthew, we can't raise our child here," she said, wiping her tears. "I know it's hard to see now, but we'll turn this place around, I promise," he replied, holding her hands. Matthew quit his teaching job to focus entirely on the land. With their savings, they bought materials to fix up the shack minimally and moved in by the end of the month. The neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived on the neighboring farm, was the first to visit, both to welcome them and to warn them. "Son, forgive me for saying it, but that land is cursed. The previous owner tried planting everything and never harvested a thing. He ended up going bankrupt and had to sell it to your father about 15 years ago, the 70-year-old woman recounted. "Do you know anything else about the previous owner?" asked Matthew, intrigued. "I know he was a very studious man, always tinkering with books and conducting experiments. They say he hid some notebooks in the cabin, but no one ever found anything when he left." This information kept nagging at Matthew's mind. That night, he began searching every corner of the cabin for those mysterious notebooks. Sarah thought he was wasting his time, but helped him anyway. It was Sarah who discovered a loose floorboard in the bedroom. Beneath it lay a small wooden box wrapped in plastic. Inside the box were 3 yellowed notebooks filled with notes and sketches. "My God, Matthew, look at this," Sarah exclaimed, flipping through one of the notebooks. The notes belonged to a certain Professor Harold Wilson, who had studied the land for years. He wrote about special minerals in the subsoil, ancient irrigation techniques, and methods for restoring degraded soil. It was like a scientific manual, but written in simple, practical terms. In the first notebook, Harold described how he had discovered that the subsoil in that region had unique characteristics. He mentioned bluish stones that appeared when digging deeper and how these stones had special properties for enriching the soil. "Sarah, do you see this? This man found something important about our land," Matthew said, excited for the first time since inheriting the property. The second notebook contained detailed sketches of an irrigation system that utilized the natural slope of the terrain, channeling water efficiently. Professor Harold explained how the bluish stones, when wet, released minerals that nourished plants. The third notebook was even more surprising. Harold had documented successful experiments with different crops, but all records stopped abruptly on a specific date. The last entry read, "The family is facing financial hardship. I must sell the land before proving my theory. I hope someday someone will continue my work." Matthew felt an immediate connection to this man who had dedicated so much time studying the same land that was now his. He decided he would try to carry on Professor Harold's work. The next morning, he began digging exactly where the notebook sketches indicated. Sarah, despite the weight of her pregnancy, insisted on helping however she could. When Matthew dug about 6 feet deep, he found the first bluish stones described in the notebooks. "Sarah, look at this. They're exactly as Professor Harold described," Matthew shouted, holding a stone with a bluish-gray hue that seemed to shine when wet. He decided to take some samples to the state university where he had previously worked. A geologist friend analyzed the stones and confirmed they were rich in rare minerals, especially potassium and phosphorus, essential for plant nutrition. "Matthew, this is an incredible discovery. If these stones are spread across your entire property, you've got a green gold mine in your hands," said the geologist, Dr. Thompson. Encouraged by the discovery, Matthew began implementing the irrigation system described in the notebooks. It was backbreaking work, and he had to do it all alone since he couldn't afford hired help. He dug trenches, placed the bluish stones at strategic points, and created channels to direct rainwater. Meanwhile, Michael and David visited their father's farm regularly, always accompanied by their well-dressed wives and imported cars. They made a point of passing by Matthew's land to mock his efforts. "Look what our little brother is up to, David. Digging holes like he's going to find treasure," said Michael, laughing loudly so Matthew could hear. "Yeah, Michael, Dad really gave him the right land. Land to bury dreams," David added, and both burst into laughter. Sarah was angry at these taunts, but Matthew asked her not to pay attention. He was determined to prove he could transform that land, not for his brothers, but for his family, and to honor Professor Harold Wilson's work. The first test came at the start of the rainy season. Matthew had prepared small garden beds exactly following the instructions from the notebooks. He planted beans, corn, and some vegetables, always mixing in the crushed bluish stones and following the irrigation system. To his joy, the first seedlings began to sprout within days. Sarah was moved when she saw the first green shoots emerging from the land everyone had considered barren. "Matthew, it's working. Professor Harold was right," she said, hugging her husband with tears of happiness. But the joy didn't last. In the 7th week, when the plants were growing well, Sarah started feeling sharp abdominal pains. Matthew rushed her to the hospital in Chicago, where the doctors said she needed complete bed rest to avoid a premature birth. "Doctor, we can't afford a private hospital stay, and our house isn't set up for her to rest properly," Matthew explained desperately. "Then you need to find a suitable place urgently, or you could lose the baby," the doctor replied seriously. Matthew swallowed his pride and went to ask his brothers for help. He found Michael in his luxurious downtown office, surrounded by executives in an important meeting. "Michael, I need to talk to you. It's about Sarah and the baby," Matthew said, clearly embarrassed. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now, back to the story." Michael dismissed the executives and listened to his brother's situation. When Matthew finished explaining, Michael sighed and crossed his arms. "Matthew, you chose to quit a stable job to play farmer. Now you want me to fix the problems you created," Michael said coldly. "I'm not asking for charity, Michael. I can pay you back when I sell my first harvest. I just need temporary help," Matthew pleaded. "Look, brother, I'd like to help, but I have my own commitments. I've invested a lot in my land and can't afford to fund other people's adventures," Michael replied, turning back to his paperwork. David's response was even worse. Not only did he refuse help, but he also suggested Matthew give up the land and return to teaching. Matthew, stop being stubborn. Sell that land to someone who can put it to better use and come back to reality. Sarah and the baby deserve a decent life, not this crazy adventure, David said condescendingly. Matthew left the meetings feeling humiliated and more determined than ever. He couldn't leave Sarah and their unborn child unprotected, but he also couldn't abandon the work he'd started on the land. Then he remembered George Parker, a neighbor he'd briefly greeted a few times. George was a 72-year-old retired man who lived in a simple but well-kept house on the next property. Matthew decided to talk to him. "Mr. George, sorry to bother you, but I need some advice," Matthew said when he found the older man tending to his small garden. George was of average height, with white hair and a warm smile. He had worked his whole life as an agronomist and had retired 5 years earlier. When Matthew shared his situation, George invited him for coffee to talk more. "Son, I've known that land you inherited for a long time. In fact, I knew Professor Harold Wilson, the previous owner, quite well," said George, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You knew him?" asked Matthew, intrigued. "Yes, I did. Harold was a very intelligent man, with a degree in agronomy from the State University. He had revolutionary theories about soil recovery, but he never got enough resources to prove everything he discovered," George explained nostalgically. "I found his notebooks, Mr. George. I'm trying to follow the methods he developed." George's eyes lit up with emotion. "You found the notebooks? Harold always said he'd hidden all his work on the property, but we could never find it. This is wonderful." George not only offered Sarah shelter during her recovery, but also his expertise to help Matthew better understand Professor Harold's methods. He had a house with 2 bedrooms and insisted the couple stay with him until the baby was born. "I won't take no for an answer. Harold was my friend, and helping you is a way to honor his memory," George said firmly. Sarah was moved by the old agronomist's generosity. For the first time in weeks, she could rest properly while Matthew continued working the land during the day. George accompanied Matthew every morning to check the plant's progress. He was amazed to see how well the bluish stone irrigation system was working. "Matthew, in 40 years in this profession, I've never seen such fast and healthy growth in reclaimed land. Harold truly discovered something special," George said, examining the corn leaves, already half a meter tall. "You really think it'll work?" asked Matthew, still uncertain. "Son, if it keeps going like this, you'll have the finest harvest in the Midwest region. But there's something you should know about your father," George said, turning serious. "What is it, Mr. George?" "Richard knew this land's potential. He and Harold were friends for many years. When Harold had to sell due to financial difficulties, Richard bought it, knowing exactly what he was getting." This revelation left Matthew confused. If his father knew the land's potential, why give it to him? The son considered the least ambitious. "Mr. George, this doesn't make sense. If my father knew the land was valuable, why not give it to Michael or David?" "Ah, my boy, Richard knows his sons well. Michael and David only care about quick money and fast results. They'd never have the patience to uncover this land's secrets. You're the only one with the humility and determination needed," George explained wisely. "But why didn't he tell me directly?" "Because Richard wanted you to discover it yourself. He knew if he told you everything, you wouldn't have the same sense of achievement. Plus, he wanted to teach his other sons a lesson about the value of honest work." This conversation changed Matthew's perspective on everything he'd been going through. He began to understand he hadn't been abandoned by his father, but chosen for a special mission. 2 weeks later, as Matthew harvested the first fruits of his labor, Sarah went into labor. Though premature, the baby was born healthy, weighing 5.5 pounds. They named him Harold in honor of the professor who'd left behind this legacy. Richard came to the hospital to meet his grandson, but remained as reserved as ever. He watched Matthew holding his son with such love and care, and his eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. "Dad, thank you for everything," said Matthew, not exactly knowing why he was thanking him, but feeling he should. "You have nothing to thank me for, son. Everything you've achieved was through your own effort," replied Richard, gently touching his grandson's head. When they returned home with the baby, Matthew went back to working the land with even more determination. The plants were growing spectacularly, and he decided to expand cultivation to every available area. George suggested they document the entire process, photographing and noting each step. He had a hunch this discovery could be very important for other farmers with degraded land. "Matthew, you're making history here. This method could help thousands of families with land considered unproductive," said George, taking pictures of the lush plants. By the 3rd month after Harold's birth, the transformation of the land was visible for miles. Where there had once been only dry earth and rocks, there were now green rows of corn, beans, squash, and various vegetables. The news spread through the Midwest region, drawing curious onlookers and skeptics. Many came just to see if it was true that the crazy professor had managed to grow plants in the worst land around. Mrs. Jenkins was one of the first to acknowledge the miracle. "My boy, in 70 years of living here, I've never seen anything like it. You've truly done the impossible," she said emotionally, gazing at the plants. The first to offer to buy the produce was Samuel, owner of the farmers market in Chicago. He was impressed by the size and quality of the vegetables Matthew brought as samples. "Son, these greens are perfect. Never seen anything so beautiful. I'll buy everything you can produce," said Samuel, examining a lettuce that seemed to glow with freshness. But not everything was smooth sailing. Michael and David were bothered by their younger brother's success. They had invested heavily in their own land, but the results weren't as spectacular as they'd hoped. Michael was dealing with pest problems in his soybean fields, while David struggled to grow quality pasture for his cattle. Ironically, the land that had seemed most promising was giving them more trouble than profit. "David, have you seen Matthew's land? How is it possible that worthless patch is producing better than ours?" asked Michael, visibly irritated. "There's got to be something wrong. No one works miracles on bad land. He must be using some heavy-duty fertilizer or something," replied David, searching for an explanation that made sense to him. Determined to uncover their brother's trick, Michael and David showed up at Matthew's farm one morning while he was working. He was watering the plants with Sarah nearby, little Harold sleeping in a stroller in the shade. "Hey, little brother, we came to see this miracle you've been working here," said Michael with a forced smile. "Feel free to look around. I've got nothing to hide," replied Matthew, continuing his work. The brothers walked between the rows of plants, examining everything suspiciously. David even plucked a few leaves to inspect, and Michael took soil samples. "Matthew, what kind of fertilizer are you using here?" Michael asked bluntly. "Fertilizer? Just the rocks I found underground, mixed with water. Nothing else," Matthew answered honestly. "Rocks? What kind of story is that?" David insisted. Matthew showed his brothers the bluish stones and briefly explained how he had discovered their properties through Professor Harold Wilson's notebooks. He didn't go into detail, but gave them enough information to satisfy their curiosity. Michael and David left the farm more confused than when they had arrived. They took samples of the stones to analyze in labs, but the results only confirmed what Matthew already knew. They were natural minerals with a high concentration of nutrients. Meanwhile, Matthew received more and more visitors interested in learning about his method. Some were curious farmers, others were agronomy students from the university. George suggested he start charging for guided tours since he was spending so much time explaining the process. "Matthew, you're providing an educational service here. There's nothing wrong with charging for it," said George. "I don't know, Mr. George. It feels strange charging people to show them something I learned from Professor Harold's notebooks." "Son, you're carrying on his work. You have every right to be rewarded for your effort and dedication." Matthew decided to take George's advice and began charging a small fee for the tours. With the money, he bought more materials to expand the crops and improve the house. By the 4th month, the harvest was ready. Matthew had never seen plants so healthy and productive. The corn had huge ears, the beans were loaded with pods, and the vegetables looked like they belonged in an advertisement. Samuel kept his promise and bought the entire harvest at above-market prices. Other people from Chicago also started seeking out Matthew's products, which quickly gained a reputation as the best in the Midwest region. "Matthew, I want to make you an offer," Samuel said during a negotiation. "How about supplying exclusively to me? I can pay a fixed monthly amount and guarantee buying everything you produce." "That's a good offer, Samuel, but I'd like to think about it. I also have other customers who trust my work." The truth was, Matthew was starting to dream bigger. He had read in Professor Harold's notebooks about the possibility of teaching other farmers to use the same method. Harold had dreamed of creating a network of producers who could turn degraded land into productive areas. Sarah fully supported her husband's plans. She had adapted well to farm life and was helping manage the business side. Little Harold grew up strong and healthy, always smiling when he saw the green plants around the house. "Matthew, I was thinking, what if we organized a course to teach other farmers?" Sarah suggested during dinner. "You read my mind, love. I was thinking the exact same thing. We could use our story as an example, show how land considered unproductive can transform with dedication and the right method." George was excited about the course idea. He offered his technical expertise to help structure the content and validate the methods scientifically. This course could revolutionize family farming in the region. How many farmers gave up on their land because they thought it was impossible to make it productive? George remarked enthusiastically. They began planning the first course for the following month. George used his university connections to attract students and professors, while Matthew and Sarah spread the word among local farmers. News of the course reached Michael and David, who were annoyed. To them, Matthew was showing off and trying to take credit for a discovery that wasn't his. "David, can you believe our brother is going to teach a farming class? The guy who 6 months ago couldn't even plant a backyard garden," said Michael indignantly. "It's a disgrace, Michael. He's taking advantage of people's good faith. What experience does he have to teach anything? I think we should talk to Dad about this. Matthew is tarnishing the family name with this charlatanry." The two brothers went to Richard to complain about Matthew's activities. They found their father in his library, reading as he always did on Sunday afternoons. "Dad, we need to talk about Matthew," Michael began. "What about Matthew?" asked Richard, closing the book and looking directly at his sons. "He's going around advertising that he's discovered a revolutionary farming method. He's charging for lessons and passing himself off as an expert," said David. "And the problem is," Richard asked calmly, "the problem is, he has no experience. He's going to deceive simple folks who believe in him. This reflects badly on our family," Michael explained. Richard slowly stood up and walked to the window overlooking the farmlands. He stayed silent for a few minutes, gazing at the scenery. "Have you visited Matthew's land recently?" he asked without turning around. "We have, Dad. The crops are growing well, but that doesn't mean he invented some new method," David replied. "And how are your lands doing?" Richard pressed. Michael and David exchanged uncomfortable glances. The truth was, their properties weren't yielding the expected results, despite all their investments. "We're facing some challenges, but that's normal in farming," Michael said defensively. "Some challenges." Richard turned to face his sons. "Michael, you lost 30% of your soybean crop to pests. David, you're having to buy cattle feed because the pasture isn't sustaining the livestock." The two were surprised. They didn't realize their father had been keeping such a close eye on their struggles. "How do you know that?" David asked. "Because I talked to other farmers in the Midwest region, and they all say the same thing. Richard Johnson's sons, who got the best land, are struggling, while the one who got the worst land is thriving." "Dad, it's not exactly like that," Michael tried to argue. "It's exactly like that. Both of you got excellent land, new tractors, capital to invest, and yet you haven't achieved results as good as Matthew, who started with land nobody wanted and no resources." Richard returned to his armchair and stared firmly at his sons. "Do you know the difference between you and Matthew? You've always had everything easy and never learned to value hard work. Matthew had to fight for every achievement, and that made him stronger and more determined." "So you approve of these lessons he wants to give?" David asked, still trying to win the argument. "Not only do I approve, I'm proud. Matthew is honoring Professor Harold Wilson's legacy and can help a lot of people with what he's learned." Michael and David left the conversation with their father even angrier. They felt Richard was favoring Matthew and being unfair to them. "David, I think Dad's losing his mind. There's no way he doesn't see that Matthew is exploiting the situation," Michael said as they walked to the car. "I agree, Michael. We have to do something before this farce harms our business in the region." Meanwhile, Matthew was putting the final touches on preparations for the first course. George had invited Dr. Thompson, the geologist who analyzed the bluish stones, to give a scientific explanation about the mineral's properties. On the scheduled day, 15 people showed up: 8 family farmers, 4 agronomy students, 2 professors from the university, and a reporter from the local paper who wanted to write a story about the method. Matthew began by telling his own story, from the moment he received the land to the first harvests. He showed Professor Harold Wilson's original notebooks and explained how he had discovered the potential of the bluish stones. "When I got this land, everyone said it was impossible to grow anything here. I even thought it was cursed land," said Matthew, drawing laughter from the audience. "But I learned there's no such thing as bad land, only misunderstood land." George added technical explanations about soil recovery, and Dr. Thompson spoke about the mineral composition of the stones and their benefits for plants. The practical demonstration was what impressed the participants the most. Matthew showed them how to identify the stones underground, prepare the irrigation system, and mix the crushed minerals into the soil. "The most important thing I learned is patience," Matthew explained. "Plants need time to adapt to their new environment. You can't expect immediate results." Mrs. Lawson, a 60-year-old farmer who had lost nearly her entire crop in the last drought, was moved by the talk. "Son, you've given me hope again. I was already thinking of selling my land because I couldn't get anything from it," she said with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Lawson, you'll make it work. You just have to believe and put in the effort. If I could do it, anyone can," Matthew replied, holding the woman's hands. The course was a great success. The journalist wrote a lengthy article for the newspaper, and soon after, requests came in for Matthew to repeat the course in other towns across the Midwest region. But success also brought problems. Michael and David were furious when they saw the article, which called Matthew the young farmer revolutionizing cultivation on degraded land. "Now he's gone too far, David. He's becoming a local celebrity with this lie," said Michael, slamming the newspaper on the table angrily. "We have to do something to stop this before it spreads even more." The two brothers decided to find people who could discredit Matthew's work. They visited other farmers in the region, trying to convince them that their brother's method was a scam. "Folks, be careful with my brother's story. He's selling illusions to simple folks who believe in miracles," Michael said at the Farmers Association meetings. "It's true. No one turns bad land into good overnight. There must be some trick he's not telling us," David added. Some farmers were confused by these claims, but most didn't pay much attention. They had seen the results on Matthew's land firsthand and knew there was no trick. Mr. Franklin, the president of the association, got straight to the point. "Michael, with all due respect, it sounds like you're jealous of your brother's success. Everyone here has seen what he's done with that land. If it's not a miracle, it's honest work." The attempt to discredit Matthew backfired. Instead of harming him, it only sparked more curiosity about his method. People who hadn't known about his work started seeking him out after hearing the controversy. By the 5th month, Matthew had already held courses in 3 different towns and had a waiting list for the next ones. He decided to formalize the venture by creating a small soil recovery consulting business. Sarah handled the administrative side, scheduling courses, answering emails, and managing finances. Little Harold was already 4 months old, and the joy of the household, always smiling when strangers came to visit the farm. "Matthew, look how many emails came in today asking about the courses," Sarah said, showing the computer screen. "There are people from other states interested." "It's incredible, Sarah. I never imagined Professor Harold's work could help so many people," replied Matthew, picking up his son. George suggested they write a book documenting the entire process, from the discovery of the notebooks to the results achieved. He knew a publisher specializing in technical books that might be interested in the project. "Matthew, this knowledge needs to be preserved and shared more widely. A book could reach thousands of people you'd never be able to teach in person," George argued. The idea of the book excited Matthew and Sarah. They began organizing all their notes, photographs, and testimonials from people who had successfully applied the method. Meanwhile, Michael and David's situation grew increasingly dire. Michael had lost a major investor who withdrew funding for his next harvest due to poor results from the previous one. David had to sell part of his cattle because he couldn't sustain them properly. The irony was cruel. The sons who had received the best land were facing financial struggles, while the son who got the worst land was thriving and building a solid business. Mrs. Amanda, Michael's wife, was the first to suggest they ask their brother-in-law for help. "Michael, why don't you talk to Matthew? He could teach you how to use this method on our land too," she suggested during a tense dinner. "Never. I won't humiliate myself by asking my younger brother for help, especially for a method I'm not even sure really works," Michael replied, his pride wounded. "But darling, his results speak for themselves. And if it really works, it could solve our problems. Amanda, drop it. I'll fix our problems my own way." David also refused any suggestion of reaching out to Matthew. To him, accepting help from his younger brother would mean admitting failure, and his pride wouldn't allow it. Their wives began questioning their stubbornness. They saw their family's finances deteriorating while Matthew prospered more each day. Melissa, David's wife, even tried visiting Matthew behind her husband's back but gave up, afraid of causing a bigger family rift. By the 6th month, Matthew's life had completely transformed. His consulting business was thriving. He had signed a contract to write the book, and his farm had become a reference center for soil recovery. Students and professors from various universities regularly visited the property to study the method. Matthew always welcomed them warmly, remembering that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. Dr. Thompson proposed a partnership with the university to conduct deeper studies on the bluish stones and their potential for large-scale soil recovery. "Matthew, you might be on the verge of a discovery that could impact global agriculture. These stones might exist in other regions with similar geological features," Dr. Thompson explained during a visit. "It would be amazing if we could help farmers in other places too," Matthew replied, always thinking of ways to expand the method's reach. George, now 73, was radiant seeing the success of the work he had helped develop. He felt as if he were fulfilling a promise made to his late friend Harold Wilson. "Matthew, I'm sure Harold would be proud to see how you've carried on his work," George said, admiring the thriving plants across the property. "Mr. George, none of this would have been possible without your help and expertise. You're an angel who came into our lives at just the right time." The relationship between Matthew and George had turned into a true partnership between grandfather and grandson. The old agronomist taught everything he knew, while Matthew brought energy and fresh ideas to expand the applications of the method. Sarah had also found her calling in their new life. She discovered a talent for the business and communication side of the company, creating educational materials and organizing the courses with increasing professionalism. "Matthew, how about we create a website to promote the method and take registrations for the online courses?" suggested Sarah, always thinking of innovations. "Great idea, honey. That way we can reach people from faraway places." Little Harold grew strong and healthy, surrounded by his family's love and the lush greenery of the farm. At 6 months old, he already showed interest in plants, always reaching out his tiny hands to touch the leaves when his father carried him during walks around the land. While Matthew's family enjoyed this time of prosperity and happiness, Michael and David were facing their worst financial moments. Michael had lost over $200,000 in the last harvest and was considering selling part of his land to pay off debts. David wasn't doing any better. His cattle had lost weight due to poor pasture, forcing him to sell them for much less than expected. Bills piled up, and the pressure grew with each passing day. It was then that news arrived that would change everything. The article about Matthew had been republished in a national farming magazine, and he was being invited to speak at conferences in other states. "I can't believe it's come to this," Michael said when he saw the magazine. "My little brother has become a national farming expert." "Michael, I think it's time we swallow our pride and talk to him," David said, admitting for the first time that they might have been wrong. "You're right, David. Our pride is leading us to ruin." The two brothers decided they would seek out Matthew, but they still didn't know how to bring it up. They had mocked their brother so much that now they felt ashamed to ask for help. Meanwhile, Richard watched the whole situation from afar, waiting for the right moment to intervene. He knew his older sons needed to learn the lesson on their own, but he also didn't want them to suffer irreversible harm. One morning, Richard showed up at Matthew's farm unannounced. He found his son working in the fields with George, while Sarah tended to little Harold under the shade of a tree. "Good morning, son. Can we talk?" Richard said, removing his brown felt hat as he always did when he wanted to show respect. "Of course, Dad." "It's good to see you here," Matthew replied, wiping his hands on his clothes before greeting his father. Richard looked carefully around the farm. The transformation was even more impressive than he had imagined. Where there had once been only dry earth and rocks, there were now neat rows of healthy, thriving plants. "Matthew, I came here to apologize," Richard said, surprising his son. "Apologize for what, Dad?" "For letting you go through all those hardships alone. I knew this land's potential, but wanted you to discover it for yourself. Maybe I was too cruel." Matthew was moved by his father's words. For the first time in his life, Richard was openly expressing his feelings. "Dad, you don't need to apologize. Everything I went through made me a better person. If you had handed me everything ready-made, I wouldn't have appreciated it the way I do now. You've become the man I always dreamed you'd be, son. Hard-working, humble, determined, and above all, generous. Seeing you teach other farmers fills me with pride." Richard then told the whole truth about his relationship with Professor Harold Wilson and how he had planned the division of the land. "Harold was my friend for over 20 years. When he needed to sell the land due to financial difficulties, I bought it knowing exactly what I was acquiring. He told me about his discoveries, but never managed to implement them fully. Why didn't you try using his method?" "I tried a few times, but I didn't have the patience required. I've always been in a hurry, wanting immediate results. Harold always said you needed the soul of a teacher to teach the land how to produce. And that's why you gave the land to me." "Exactly. You were the only one of my children who had the necessary qualities: humility to learn, patience to wait for results, and generosity to share knowledge." This conversation completely changed the relationship between father and son. Richard finally managed to express the love and pride he felt for Matthew, while Matthew understood he had never been rejected by his father, but chosen for a special mission. "Dad, what about my brothers? They're going through hard times," said Matthew, always concerned about family. "Michael and David need to learn that true success comes from honest work, not shortcuts, but I think they're starting to understand that." "Do you think they'd talk to me if I offered help?" "I'm sure they would. Their pride is shaken, but desperation is stronger than vanity." Richard suggested that Matthew make the first move, reaching out to his brothers to offer help. He knew Michael and David well, and understood they were too proud to ask for help, but humble enough to accept if it was given generously. "Son, you could be your brother's salvation, but it will only work if they truly want to change," Richard warned. "Dad, I've never held a grudge against them. If they want to learn, I'll always be willing to teach." The next day, Matthew decided to visit Michael at his farm. He found his brother staring dejectedly at a soybean field that had been ravaged by pests and was practically lost. "Michael, I came to see how you're doing," said Matthew, approaching his brother. Michael turned, surprised by the visit. His pride still kept him from showing his true situation, but it was clear he was discouraged. "Hey, Matthew. I'm fine. Just dealing with some technical issues here," said Michael, trying to downplay the situation. "Michael, I know you're struggling. I came to offer help." "What kind of help?" "I can teach you the method I learned from Professor Harold's notebooks. It's not a miracle, but it works when applied correctly." Michael fell silent for a few minutes, wrestling with his pride. He looked at the devastated field and then at his brother, who was offering help sincerely. "Matthew, I need to admit I underestimated you. And I also need to admit I'm desperate," said Michael, finally lowering his guard. "Michael, there's nothing to admit. We're brothers, and brothers help each other in tough times. Do you really think I can restore this land? I'm sure of it. Your land is much better than mine was. With the right method and dedication, you could get even better results than I did." Michael accepted his brother's help, and for the first time in months he felt hope. Matthew spent the whole afternoon explaining the basic principles of the method and scheduled to return the next day with George to conduct a full analysis of the property. Approaching David was a bit harder. He was more resistant and took longer to admit he needed help. But when he saw the first results on Michael's land, his resistance weakened. David, don't be ashamed to learn. I also had to learn everything from scratch, said Matthew during his first visit to his brother's farm. It's just hard to accept that my younger brother knows more than I do about farming, David admitted honestly. David, I don't know more than you, I just learned a different method. And this method works because it was developed by someone much smarter than all of us, Professor Harold. Matthew's strategy was always to credit Professor Harold, minimizing any sense of superiority and making it easier for his brothers to accept. David also accepted the help, and soon the three brothers were working together for the first time as adults. Matthew divided his time between his own farm, the courses and consulting he provided in the Midwest region, and guiding his brothers. George was moved to see the family reunited through work. He had always believed knowledge had the power to bring people together, and now he was witnessing it firsthand. Matthew, look how beautiful this is. Three brothers working together, each learning from the other, George remarked during a visit to Michael's farm. That's true, Mr. George. My father always said a united family is everything. Now I understand what he meant. The first changes on Michael's and David's land began to show within weeks. The plants responded quickly to the new method, and the soil quality visibly improved each day. Richard visited all three farms regularly, observing each son's progress. For the first time in years, he saw his three sons working in harmony and with purpose. Sarah, I've never seen my father-in-law so happy, Amanda, Michael's wife, commented during lunch at Matthew's house. It's true. He's overjoyed seeing his sons united. I think that's all he ever wanted, Sarah replied, gently rocking little Harold in her arms. The wives of the three brothers also grew closer during this time. Amanda and Melissa began visiting Sarah regularly, forming a mutual support network. Sarah, I wanted to apologize for our husband's behavior at the beginning. They were jealous but too ashamed to admit it, Amanda said during one of these visits. Amanda, there's no need to apologize. What matters is that we're all united now. By the 8th month since Matthew had received his inheritance, the results were remarkable. His farm had become a model of success, Michael had fully recovered his soybean crop, and David had the best pasture he'd ever had. The transformation wasn't just agricultural, it was also familial. The three brothers had developed a much closer and more respectful relationship. Michael and David learned to value knowledge and humility, while Matthew discovered his leadership and teaching abilities. Richard decided it was time for one final announcement to the family. He called his three sons, their wives, and little Harold for a special dinner at the farm. Boys, I have an important announcement, Richard said once everyone was gathered at the table. I've decided that the three of you will become equal partners in all the family's land. What do you mean, Dad? Michael asked, surprised. I'm dividing all the land equally among the three of you. It doesn't matter anymore who got what first. What matters is that you've learned to work together. David was deeply touched by his father's decision. Dad, you didn't have to do this. We've already learned our lesson. That's exactly why I'm doing it. You've proven you deserve to be treated as equals. Matthew was the most surprised of all. He had never expected to receive more land. He was happy with what he'd achieved. Dad, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, son. You've already proven your worth by teaching your brothers and so many others. Now, I want the three of you to work together to expand this consulting business. The idea of growing the company as a partnership between the three brothers excited everyone. Michael would contribute his expertise in management and marketing, David with his experience in livestock, and Matthew with his soil restoration method. Dad, this is the best idea you've ever had, said Michael, hugging Richard emotionally. George was present at dinner as the family's special guest. Richard made sure to honor him publicly for the help he had given Matthew. George, you were essential to the success of all this. I want you to be our company's official technical consultant, Richard offered. It would be an honor, Richard. At 73, I can still contribute something. Sarah suggested they create an institute in honor of Professor Harold Wilson to preserve and expand his methods of sustainable agriculture. How about the Harold Wilson Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, she proposed. Perfect, Sarah, said Matthew. This way we keep alive the memory of the man who made all this possible. The family spent the entire night making plans for the future. They wanted to expand the courses to other states, write more technical books, and help as many small farmers as possible. Little Harold slept peacefully in his mother's arms, surrounded by the love and harmony of the family. He would grow up in an environment of unity, hard work, and generosity, values his parents and grandfather had worked so hard to build. The following month, the consulting business was officially registered as a partnership between the three brothers. The Harold Wilson Institute was established as a non-profit to conduct research and offer free courses for low-income farmers. Dr. Thompson would oversee the institute's scientific research, while George would handle the development of new application methods. The university became an official partner, providing labs and students to expand the studies. The institute's first project was to map other regions that might have geological features similar to Matthew's farm. The discovery that the bluish stones existed in various parts of the American heartland opened immense possibilities for family farming. Mrs. Lawson, the 60-year-old farmer who had attended Matthew's first course, became one of the method's biggest advocates. She fully restored her land and became a knowledge multiplier in her region. "Son, you gave me back hope and dignity. Now I can leave productive land for my children," she said during a visit to the institute. Stories like Mrs. Lawson's multiplied across the heartland. Professor Harold's method, refined and systematized by Matthew and his team, was transforming the lives of hundreds of families. Michael discovered he had a talent for the business and strategic side of the company. He formed partnerships with farmers' cooperatives and developed a course distribution system that reached even the most remote areas. David found his calling in sustainable livestock, adapting the bluish stones method to improve pastures and create integrated farming and livestock systems. "Everyone, do you realize our father is a visionary?" David said during a company meeting. "He planned all this from the start." "It's true," Michael agreed. "He knew exactly what he was doing when he divided the land that way. Our father taught us life's most important lesson, that a person's worth isn't in what they receive, but in what they build with dedication," Matthew added. Richard continued to oversee the development of the business and the institute, but now as an advisor, not a commander. He had learned to delegate responsibilities and trust in his children's abilities. At 69, Richard discovered a new passion, teaching little Harold about nature and the value of hard work. Grandfather and grandson spent hours walking around the farm, with Richard explaining about plants, animals, and the importance of caring for the land. "Grandpa, why do we have to water the plants?" Harold asked at just 1.5 years, already curious about everything he saw. "Because plants are like people, my boy. They need water, food, and care to grow healthy," Richard answered patiently. 1.5 years after receiving the inheritance, Matthew was giving a lecture at a national agriculture conference when he got a phone call that would change his life once again. "Matthew, it's Dr. Thompson. I need to speak with you urgently about a discovery we've made." "What is it, doctor? Did something happen?" "Matthew, we've found evidence that the bluish stones exist in at least 15 American states. We're talking about millions of acres of land that could be restored using this method." The realization that the method could have a national impact made Matthew rethink the entire project. They would need far more resources and organization to meet such a massive demand. "Sarah, can you imagine how many families we could help if this is true?" Matthew said when he shared the news with his wife. "It's a huge responsibility, Matthew, but it's also an incredible opportunity to make a difference in so many lives." Michael and David were equally amazed by the possibilities that opened up. They decided to focus all the company's efforts on expanding the project nationwide. "Brothers, I think our little family business is about to become something much bigger than we ever imagined," Michael said during a meeting. The federal government took interest in the project and offered financial support to expand research and implement pilot programs in different regions of the country. Matthew was invited to present the method at international universities, and soon inquiries began pouring in from other countries with similar geological conditions. "Matthew, it seems Professor Harold Wilson's work will impact not just the United States, but possibly the whole world," George remarked, proud to have helped preserve and develop his old friend's knowledge. 2 years after receiving what had once seemed like a curse, Matthew found himself leading a movement that was revolutionizing family farming in the American heartland. His farm had become a research center visited by scientists from around the world. Michael and David had become experts in their fields and were nationally recognized for their contributions to sustainable agriculture. The Johnson family had transformed from a group divided by vanity and envy into a team united by purpose and love. Richard had fulfilled his greatest dream, seeing his children working together for something bigger than themselves. Little Harold grew up surrounded by this harmony and sense of purpose. By age 2, he already showed the same fascination with nature that had defined his father and grandfather. "Daddy, when I grow up, I'm going to help the plants too," Harold said, holding a tiny seedling in his little hands. "Of course you will, my boy, and you'll do it even better than your dad," Matthew replied, moved by the thought that the legacy would continue for another generation. George, now 75, had become a father figure to the entire family. He shared his wisdom not just about farming, but about life, teaching everyone that true success comes from the ability to serve others. "My children, you've learned the most important lesson there is. The more we give, the more we receive," George would say during the Sunday dinners that became a family tradition. The property Matthew had inherited became the heart of a complex that included a research center, a sustainable farming school, and laboratories for developing new methods. Tourists from all over the United States visited the site to see the miracle land that had changed one family's life and inspired a national movement for sustainable agriculture. "Sarah, sometimes I stop and think about how much our lives have changed. It feels like a dream," Matthew would say on quiet evenings when the two of them gazed at the stars after putting Harold to sleep. "It's a dream that came true because you never gave up. Even when everything seemed impossible," Sarah would reply, holding her husband's hand. "It wasn't just my determination, Sarah. It was our family's love, Mr. George's wisdom, and most of all, Professor Harold Wilson's legacy that made all this possible." Matthew's story became legendary in the Midwest region and later gained national recognition. Documentaries were made, books were written, and universities created courses based on the method he had rediscovered and perfected. But for Matthew, the greatest success wasn't in public recognition or financial gain. It was in knowing he had honored the legacy of those who came before him and built something that would benefit future generations. "Dad, thank you for giving me exactly what I needed. Not what I thought I wanted," Matthew said during Harold's 3rd birthday celebration when the whole family was gathered. "Son, you turned what seemed like a punishment into the greatest blessing our family has ever known." "I'm the proudest father in the world," Richard replied, moved. Michael and David had also found peace and purpose in their lives. They learned that true value wasn't in competing with each other, but in working together toward common goals. "Matthew, I want you to know you taught me how to be a better person," Michael said during the toast that special night. "And me too," David added. "You showed us that humility and generosity are the greatest riches anyone can have." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of perseverance and family unity. Do you believe Richard made the right decision by giving the seemingly worst land to his most humble son? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know if you have similar stories in your family. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories like this one.